Hi, welcome back, and thanks for joining me again. I'm Roger Mitek. I'm the founder of Prud'homme Beer Certification, and this is our second of our style sessions. And one of the styles that I've always been really fascinated in, and one of the countries of brewing history that fascinates me are the British. And the reason that I'm so fascinated by British brewing is they took a different approach than a lot of others. And beer has been a big part of British culture for a long period of time, and we know that pubs are so important in British culture, so we want to explore a little bit more about that. But we want to talk about something that, again, changed the world: British pale ales. And in the 1400s, Dutch immigrants and Belgian immigrants, when they came into England, introduced hops into England. And there are 6 noble varieties of hops. 3 of them are from Germany, 1 from the Czech Republic, and 2 from Great Britain or England. And the 2 that come from Great Britain or England are Fuggles and East Kent Goldings. So those are really, really important steps. And then we have to look at how this whole thing developed with pale ales. And British styles are really kind of unique because they are more likely to be named because they're a comparative to something else as opposed to anything else. So a British pale ale, let's pour one first and then we can have a look at it and talk. I'm going to feature Spitfire from Shepherd Neame. Shepherd Neame is the oldest independent brewery in the UK. It's a wonderful brewery. It's in Kent. This is it was originally called a Kentish ale a little while ago, but they're calling it an amber ale. But to me, this is a British pale ale, and it could also be known as a bitter, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So I'm using a glass that I acquired quite a long time ago when I used to sell Bass beer, and I'm using the Bass glass because I think it's an outstanding glass to put a British pale ale in. It's got these really nice characteristics. I'll talk a little bit more about the glass in a second. So we're getting a nice pour again with good foam on top. In this case, the foam is an ivory color, so it's dictating that we're not looking at pale malts anymore. We're now looking at more caramel malts or crystal malts. It's giving us that wonderful color. Really, really tight foam on the top. It's amazing. You look on top, it looks like shaving cream, and they're really tight bubbles. When you hold this beer up to the light, you can see that it's got this beautiful aura to it. It's whiskey colored caramel. I love the descriptors that you can find in foods because it creates a more romantic image of what this beer looks like. Crystal clear, again, because British brewers do not historically believe in putting a beer out that's unfiltered. They believe in creating thirst-quenching, easy-drinking beers, and so again, they're going to filter to make it crystal clear. It's an amber color. It looks like a ripe peach or a cooked peach. It's got all these great characteristics to it. And when you smell it, it's really interesting because for the most part, what you're going to get is exactly what I was just talking about. You're going to get caramel, toffee, whole grain breads, whole wheat toast, honey. There's a hint of apricot on these beers. Orange marmalade is also a big significant contributor to these styles of beers, but they're wonderfully complex. And you're expecting a ton of body and flavor, but there isn't. There is some really nice subtle notes to it. And a lot of times when we look at darker beers, we think they're going to be more intense. Wow, that's so good. Lots of caramel, toffee again, a little bit more roasted grains. You're getting a little bit of chocolate in there and some subtle coffee notes. Slightly smoky. There's again a little bit more of the orange marmalade apricot characteristics in there. A little bit of strawberry licorice on the nose. We want these things to open up and breathe. There also is a big earthy character to British pale ales, almost like forest floor, like you were walking through a freshly rained forest. It's got that really nice dampness to it. And that characteristic is coming from the British hops. British hops are notably very herbal and very earthy. You might get a little bit of mushroom note on this, like fresh button mushrooms. That's kind of really dried mushrooms. Those are good characteristics that we're looking for typically in a true to style British ale. The other thing is, as you draw this beer through your mouth, you'll notice that it's extremely soft. It doesn't have a lot of tingle, it doesn't have a lot of carbonation to it, and that is A, by design, and B, that is the signature characteristic. So typically speaking, the reason that there's lower CO2 is British beers have always been poured on cask, or what we know as real ales these days. And when you pump a beer from a cask, you have to use something called a beer engine. And a beer engine works like a hand pump on a water well. So what's happening is, as you pump, you've seen these things on Coronation Street, or you've seen it in some of your local pubs that are pouring real ales. You pull on a hand pump toward you like this, and what's happening is you're forcing air into the cask, and the air becomes the counter pressure system that allows the beer to come out of the tap. So air is about 70% nitrogen, so these are not heavily carbonated beers. The benefit is that with lower CO2, we don't get bloated as much, and it allows us to sit and enjoy. These are the original session beers. If you've ever heard the term session, it's because of these beers. It was about going down to the pub for a session with your mates. And so these beers are soft, they're gentle, they're extremely well made, they're very, very high quality, they taste the same all the time. Consistency and quality are really key trademarks of true to style beers and experienced brewers. It just gets better, more toffee, more caramel every time you open up and smell it. So let's get into the story of how British Pale Ales came to be. So in the 1600s, Great Britain was exporting a lot of beers around the world. A lot of what they were exporting were porters and stouts. These became very, very dominant beers. They were very dark, very roasted. A lot of the porter producers, the Napoleonic Wars happened in the 1600s, and one of the big issues that came in was that they created a malt tax in order to finance the war. And a lot of the beer producers, in order to stay financially viable, decided that they would no longer use malt, that they would just use roasted barley to create the color and the flavor in their beers. And so by using roasted barley, you create this really intense color, flavor, but you're not paying malt tax because there's really no sugars that are being derived from those particular beers themselves. So porters became a huge style, and porters I will get into at a later date when we do more style sessions down the road. But porters were basically named for the men within the community that took goods back and forth from stores to ship. So they were called porters, and it was originally a beer called Three Threads. So more about that later. So all these beers were really, really dark. And then as we discussed with Pilsners last session, British brewers started using Coke in order to use a more refined heating technique to create lighter colored malts. So these beers are called pale ales because they are paler than British brown ales, porters, and stouts. They are not pale in our eyes. We now think that a lot of light golden colored beers can be referred to as pale, but these beers are very, very rich and dense in color. So they're not really pale, but they are paler than previous versions of these beers. They're also known as bitters. And they're bitters because they were more bitter than a traditional English mild was at that time. So a lot of people, a lot of consumers, beer drinkers, started to refer to these as a pint of bitter. And so the term bitter and the term British Pale Ale are synonymous. They can be actually termed either or. And then we have a variation of these. So we have bitter, extra special bitter, and each time they go up in alcohol and a little bit more intense flavors and more complexity to them as well. So an ESB is an extra special bitter. Wonderful, easy drinking beers, but they started in a place called Burton-upon-Trent. And Burton-upon-Trent has the hardest water in the brewing community. It has the highest levels of calcium and magnesium anywhere in the world. And a long time ago, there used to be 32 brewers in Burton-upon-Trent. In the 1700s, we found about 32 brewers. There's still about 8 active breweries there. Bass was one of them, Marston's was another. There's some incredible beers, but there was a really interesting discovery was that The high level of minerality in the water actually brought out the characteristics in the hops, and it activated it a little bit more. So we got a little bit more intensity, a little bit more bitterness. But the thing with British pale ales and bitters, and British beers typically, is that the British brewers feel that malt should be the star of the show, and hops should be a supporting role. And so in this case, the malts are really the critical characteristic in this particular beer, and the hops become more of a balancing act. So they balance out some of the sweetness. In this beer, the IBUs are probably somewhere in the 32 to 35 range, but they taste like they're in the 20 range because there's such good malt profile in here and so much caramel and toffee and whole grain breads that you don't really taste the intense bitterness in here. Plus, the other thing is that with the lower level of carbonation, this is a much softer beer when it comes to the bitterness. Very, very easy to drink. Amazing beer. Great with a ton of different foods, because these beers, when you think about it, one of the great things about pairing beer and food up is that the flavors in beer mimic the flavors in food quite often because we've cooked beer and we've cooked the grains. So a lot of times, because we're caramelizing anything that we're cooking, we're getting the same kind of flavor profiles out. That's why these particular beers are probably the easiest to match with any kind of food than you would possibly imagine, especially if it's been cooked or it's been caramelized. So any kind of meats that are on the grill, great idea. Pub food's obviously fantastic, great with curries, sort of brings down the intensity of the spice so that you can taste the subtleties. You can put these in a lot of different glasses. The wider the glass, the reason I like this glass is the narrowness at the bottom keeps the CO2 quite active, so it's giving me a little bit more sharpness on the taste. And then because it blossoms up here at the mouth, it actually allows all of the aromatics to come out. It's just a wonderful beer to enjoy. It's a wonderful thing to share with somebody, but it's way different than American pale ales, which we'll get into in future sessions. So thanks for joining. Hope to see you next week. Cheers.